Please be seated. So for 4 Sundays now, we've been looking at Mary's song, taking a couple of verses at a time and trying to unpack some of the significant gifts that this song offers to us as followers of Jesus Christ and as people of God. The first Sunday we looked at what it meant to be favored by God, and that being chosen by God was never a choosing for a place of privilege, but being chosen in order that we might become instruments of making God's will present on earth as in heaven. And that chosenness does not protect or keep us from pain or from suffering or from struggle, but it does give us a sense of participation in something far greater and bigger than we ourselves could ever be about. We looked at goodness and mercy the second week and how in humility Mary discovers the great things that God has done that she could not have done herself, and revisits some of the historical works of God in the history of her people, and also discovers that humility is not just the door to seeing God at work in our lives, but humility is the door that opens us to the mercy of God and the forgiveness of God as well. Last week we looked at how God prefers to work this transforming of human history and human society from the bottom up and from the outside in, choosing to work with those who are excluded and marginalized and set outside the privileges and benefits of a community or a society or a nation. Today I want to look at the very last piece of Mary's promise song, where she says, God has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, even as he promised our fathers. I want to look today at God's promise. God's promise. A promise that Mary holds on to, not as a promise that will make everything all better in this moment or fix everything in the time frame that we want, but a promise to be with us. To be with us. Now, the Presbyterian women's study for this year is called God's Promise, I Will Be With You. And the women who gather, guys too, a few guys, gather on Monday morning, and we're working through the story of God's promise throughout Scripture, this promise to be with us. And we started looking at Abraham and how God promised to be with Abraham, to bless Abraham so that Abraham would be a blessing to others. God promised to work through Abraham to bless all nations. Then God promises to be with Isaac as he wanders as a fugitive from his brother throughout various parts of the Middle East, and that Isaac discovers God is with him wherever he goes. And then Jacob, Isaac's son, is promised God's presence in the strange places that he also goes, in part because he has been something of a trickster, and he's got a reputation that's following close behind him. And despite his errors and his failures, God promises to accompany him. To Moses, who hears God's promise to be with him as he confronts the most powerful leader in that entire part of the world, Pharaoh, in search of freedom and liberation for his people. To Gideon, who God promises to be with as he goes into battle against insurmountable odds. To David, who he promises to be with as he flees the wrath of Saul, the king, who he will eventually take the place of. To Solomon, David's son, who God promises to be with, to give him wisdom to be able to lead well his people. To Isaiah, whom God promises to be with, even when the temple is destroyed and they are carted off to Babylon. I will be with you. To Mary, who receives God's promise, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you." To Jesus, whose very name, Emmanuel, means God with us. To the last night, Jesus was with his disciples, and he says, "I will be with you. I will give you my Spirit to live within you so that you will never be apart from me. And I will never be apart from you." To his final words in Matthew's Gospel, "Lo, I am with you always to the end of the age." Throughout the entire span of Scripture, character after character, person after person, men, women, children experience this promise: "I will be with you." And yet, there are times we don't feel that. There are times we experience our life to be cut off from presence instead of filled with it. What is it that gets in the way of our experiencing that promise? There are probably myriad ways to answer that question. But today I want to focus on one that I've found to be true in my own life, and that I suspect some of you may also resonate with. It's a reflection on a little proverb that I learned from Gracie, that she learned from her 12-step friends. It says, "Expectations are premeditated disappointment." Expectations are premeditated disappointment. Now, just think about that for a minute in terms of, family celebrations around Christmas, right? My son Owen has just driven from San Antonio to Orlando, Florida with a trailer, because they're going to be moving next summer, and they're taking the first load now. And so he drove until about 10 o'clock and slept 4 hours in the car, and then drove the rest of the way this morning and finally got there. Hopefully he hasn't texted me yet, but I think he's there. And as I was driving in this morning, we were talking about all of the expectations that his fiancée Beverly has around family celebration. She has been working really hard to orchestrate this perfect family Christmas. And she found out just yesterday that one of the people who she really, really wanted to be there is going to have to work and can't be there. And she was like, "I told you a month ago to ask for those days off." And she was getting all worked up about it because her expectations were not going to be met because somebody forgot, or maybe the boss required. Who knows what happened, but the expectations are so high and so big and so important that when something happens to break them, all of a sudden there's an emotional fracture and the whole thing kind of falls apart emotionally for us. I'm sure none of you have experienced that. But it got me to thinking about just how our expectations about God showing up get in the way of our being able to see God the way God actually does show up. Our first Advent gathering was at Helen and Hiram's house. And I think about 15 people signed up to go to that. And half an hour after it was supposed to start, there was 5 people. And there was a time in my ministry where I would have been really pissed about that. Right? I could have said, "God, these people are just so irresponsible. Why don't they just grow up? They make a commitment. Why don't they fulfill their commitment? I did all this preparation, and now there's only 5 people here." I could have done that, and I have done that in other periods of time. But not that night. And what we discovered is that the particular folks who happened to be there, who showed up at that time, had the opportunity to dig deep and to share broadly about things that likely never would have been spoken if 15 people had been there. And it was a gift of grace and of presence and of love that gratefully I didn't get in the way of by being pissed off. You see what I'm saying? How we can let our expectations interrupt our capacity to experience the gift that's actually given in that moment. And I think we do that in a variety of ways. And there's 4 of them I want to just briefly talk about that came to me as I was reflecting on this today. The first is that sometimes we expect God's presence to show up in a particular way, to look a certain way. That God's presence is going to mean this will happen. You're going to get tingles, or you're going to be moved to tears, or I don't know what it is for you, but we have this sense sometimes that if God's really present, then this is going to happen, or this is what it's going to look like. So the other day, we were making cookies, and Beth sent me into the kitchen. She said, go get my nut chopper. I was like, sure. So I went into the kitchen, the catering kitchen, which is big, and there's lots of drawers, and things are all over the place. And so I didn't know exactly where it was. So I start looking around, and I'm looking around, and I can't find a nut chopper. Because in my head, a nut chopper looks a certain way. The nut chopper I'm looking for is round, cylinder, it's got a little round thing, and you go chung, 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 chung on the top of it. That's what I'm looking for. And there's nothing like that in the whole kitchen. I go back, I go, honey, it's not there. It's got to be somewhere else. And she's like, it's in there. And she walks in there with me. She opens the drawer and she says, here's the nut chopper. And it looked totally different. It was her great-grandmother's nut chopper. It had no resemblance whatsoever to anything I had ever used. But because I was looking for a certain thing, I couldn't see the thing that was right there in front of me. Has that ever happened to you?
Yes.
We do that with God, too. We're like, God, if there's not a full church, you're not there. If I don't feel it move me to some emotional high, you're not there. If there's not something that I can take away, you're not there. But that's not the promise God makes. The promise God makes is to be there. And often what gets in the way of our experiencing God's there-ness is our own imagination, what that should look like. Sometimes we expect the presence of God to show up within a particular time frame that we set, right? God, I need you to find me a mate this year. God, I need to find that new job by this summer. God, I need you to get my boss out of this office and give me a new one by tomorrow. You know? But that's not how it works, is it? My friend Matt was dying of AIDS. And I went to be with him within the last couple of weeks of his life. And I had prayed and prayed and prayed for him to get well, and he didn't get well. And we all know why now. At that point in time, we didn't have the capacity. We didn't know how to do that. And I sat with him and I sang with him. And he could barely get up and get himself to the bathroom. And he was angry and he was frustrated and he was mad at the world and mad at God. And I just wanted him to be better. I wanted him to come to some peace before he died. But what I had to recognize was that Matt was not going to be healed until he died. That it was actually, for him, death that would set him free from his pain and his resentment and his suffering. And that nothing else was going to be able to do that. That was not my time frame. It was not what I wanted. But when I could let go of that, I could simply allow myself to experience the love of a decades-long friendship in its last days. And be grateful for the gift that we had had. So sometimes it's our expectation around time frame that keeps us from being able to see God present. Sometimes we expect God to be in a particular place. Like if I go here, God ought to be there. Because God's been there before and I need God to be there now. But sometimes we lose those places. Sometimes we go back to them and it's not the same. That happened in an enormous way for the nation of Israel. They lost the temple, the literal house of God in their conceptualization. The place where God dwelt was utterly eradicated by the Babylonians. They did not have a place for God to be. They didn't have a place. Their holy land was no longer theirs. They utterly lost their place of encounter. And what they had to discover was that expectation was blinding them to the fact that God was with them also in Babylon, in the land of their conquerors, and that they could connect to God there just as they used to in the temple. Our expectation about place has to be here in the sanctuary, has to be in my holy prayer spot, wherever that is, has to be whatever it has to be. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be. God is there. And that's what he asks us to trust, that God is there. And then there's that expectation that presence of God is going to have a certain emotional feeling character. In our Wednesday study at Bertha's house, we're reading a book by Mark Yaconelli called The Gift of Hard Things. And last week we read the story of his own life, but also the life of Mother Teresa. And the 11-year stretch when she experienced what most spiritual directors will call the dark night of the soul. Teresa, when she was a young woman and into her young adult life, had many, many mystical encounters of deep, profound intimacy with God. And those encounters stimulated, motivated her faith, encouraged her to join an order and then to establish the order that she did in Calcutta to serve the most destitute in the streets of Calcutta. And within a year of establishing that order, she experienced an utter withdrawal of God's presence as she had known it prior to that. No more intimacy. It's like she used to call on God and God would literally answer her in ways she could perceive. And it was gone. Completely gone. No matter what she prayed, no matter how she fasted, no matter where she went, no matter what she did, she could not connect to God the way she had connected to God all the rest of her life up until that point. And that darkness, that absence, perceived absence of God, lasted for 11 years. That's a long time to feel disconnected from a God you had been like this with. In her biography, she writes about a wise spiritual director who, when she finally admitted, because she didn't want to admit it, when she finally admitted to him what she was experiencing, he said, "It sounds to me like you are experiencing what Jesus experienced on the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? You have entered deeply into the suffering of Jesus and are one with it in this experience." That insight opened the door to her. For she realized that what God had been doing for the last 11 years was helping her to experience in her own flesh and soul the sense of abandonment that the people who were dying on the streets of Calcutta were experiencing. And that depth of abandonment, that experience of lostness, that experience of worthlessness, gave her the ability to enter into and empathize with the dying who had no one except the rats on the street to accompany them. And it changed her capacity to engage that ministry for the rest of her life. We think God's not there, but God was there the whole time. She just couldn't feel it and thought it was gone. So I want to leave you with that promise that sometimes we can't feel or experience because our own expectations have created a lens or a filter or a blockage to our ability to perceive that God is there. Because the promise is from Abraham to the disciples and then to us that God is always there. Always. And my hope is that if you enter into a time or a space or a place where you cannot taste and touch and feel God the way you used to, or the way you expected to, that you can just hang on to a promise that might be imperceivable, but it's nevertheless true. Lo, I am with you always. Let us pray. In those dark nights, in those times of the soul when we feel utterly disconnected from you, Lord, please give us the grace to hold on to the promise, even if we can't perceive. And one day, may we discover the capacity to see what has been unseen, that you indeed have been there all along.